Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we will discuss about the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is an economic graph that was created by Arthur Laffer, an American economist and professor and advisor to the then president of USA, Ronald Reagan. The curve is named after Arthur Laffer, who popularized the concept in the 1970s. That he said that there is an optimal tax rate or an efficient tax rate, basically the optimal tax rate or an efficient tax rate that maximizes government revenue, right? However, Laffer stated himself that he did not invent the Laffer curve, as in he did not invent the concept of the Laffer curve. That is, he did not invent the concept. And he cited numerous antecedents, including the Muqaddimah by the 14th century Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun. Now, all of this is just extra knowledge to give you context. You don't have to mention all of this in the exam, right? So he said that he did not invent the concept, and he cited numerous antecedents, including the Muqaddimah by the 14th century Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun. And I'm quoting from Wikipedia, and I quote, Ibn Khaldun, who was the 14th century philosopher, he wrote in his work that was named the Muqaddimah, and he was an Islamic scholar, that, and I quote from Wikipedia, that he said, it should be known that at the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments. Now, this is just a quote that I've quoted, and so it's pretty much giving the similar concept that what the Laffer curve is suggesting at, which simply tells us that the concept has existed in the world before Laffer came up with this curve, right? However, in the exam, what you must write is that yes, Laffer curve is an economic graph created by Arthur Laffer, an American economist and professor. You must also write that the Laffer curve is a graphical representation that illustrates the relationship between tax rates such as income tax and the tax revenue collected basically by the government, right? It is believed, by the way, that this curve was drawn out on a dinner napkin in the spur of a moment by Arthur Laffer. And what Laffer suggested was in this curve that Laffer suggested that there is a certain tax rate, which is this tax rate, at which the government is basically going to maximize its tax revenues that are measured on the vertical axis. And beyond this tax rate, the tax revenues would start falling. Right? What the Laffer curve says is that at a tax rate of 0%, at a tax rate which is measured on the horizontal axis at a tax rate of 0%, right, the government collects absolutely no tax. Tax revenue will be zero. Well, this is kind of obvious, right? However, as the tax rate begins to go up, as the tax rates begins to increase, right, so does the tax revenues begin to increase, right? The tax revenues collected will begin to rise. Eventually, as the tax rate continues to increase, tax revenue will begin to plateau until the government sets its tax rate at an optimal percentage. And it is this optimal percentage rate that Laffer suggested that the government will collect, right? He suggested that it is this optimal tax rate that the government will end up collecting, or the government will collect its maximum tax revenues. And you can see from this curve that over here, you at this tax rate, it could be any rate, you have your maximum tax revenue collection, right? So he said the government will collect its maximum tax revenues from taxpayers at the optimal or the efficient tax rate, right? It's called the optimum or the efficient tax rate. He said that if the government continues to increase taxes beyond this tax rate, that is, if the government continues to increase the taxes beyond the efficient tax rate, we can see, he said that the tax revenues would start falling. And that is why, as the curve goes up, then it starts coming down, right? So, he said that if the government continues to increase taxes beyond this tax rate, what happens is, he said that taxpayers will lose the incentive to work longer hours, because the more they earn, the more they are taxed, right? So it will be counterproductive, right? They will lose the incentive to work longer hours because of a high tax rate. Because the more they earn, the more they are taxed, and this will cause the workers to work less hours or the workers to work less, which will obviously end up driving government tax revenues down. Because the less they work, the less incomes will be generated and the less tax revenues will be collected by the workers. And this causes and what happens is this causes the workers to work less, which drives government tax revenues below. The government's tax revenue starts going down. It drives the government tax revenues below the maximum tax revenue they have collected. It starts to drive the tax revenues below the maximum tax revenue that they have collected, at the revenue maximizing tax rate, which is the optimal tax rate, right? And if if taxes basically continue to rise still, if they still continue to rise, tax revenues will fall even further. It will just keep on falling until workers have no incentive to work at all. Like if the tax rate is maybe over here, let's say the tax rate is 100%, at this point, workers have no incentive to work at all because most or all of their income goes to the government as taxes, right? Now, economists do agree that there is indeed a correlation between the tax rates and the incentive to work and the government tax revenue. So they do agree that yes, as far as the tax rate is concerned and the subsequent incentive to work is concerned and the government tax revenue is concerned, there is a correlation. And by the way, when we talk about the tax rate here, so it's not just, we're not just talking about a specific kind of tax. It's not just, and we're talking about income tax. We're talking about tax rates in general, like, income taxes, corporate taxes. So we're talking about tax rates in general here, establishing a relationship between, tax rates in general across the economy and the tax revenue, right? So economists agree that yes, there's a correlation. However, at the same time, they also agree that it is nearly impossible to pinpoint the exact tax rate that will maximize tax revenues for the government because every economy is different, right? So determining the exact point of maximum revenue and understanding the complex dynamics of taxation and economic behavior is challenging. That's what they agree on, right? But nonetheless, still, the Laffer curve remains an influential concept in our discussion of economics, especially surrounding tax policy and government revenue. Now, you see, to better understand the Laffer curve, if let's say a country, it doesn't really has a tax rate, it has a tax rate of 0%. In this scenario, the government would not collect any tax revenue. But on the other hand, if the tax rate was 100%, it means that all income is taxed and confiscated by the government. It means that people would end up having no incentive to work. They would have no incentive to invest. Individuals would have no incentive to invest and start a business or engage in any sort of productive economic activities. And so as a result, tax revenue would again be zero, right? So at a zero tax rate, the tax revenue is zero. At a 100% tax rate, what Laffer meant was, even the tax rate was 100%, don't think that people would end up giving all the income as taxes. People would have no incentive to work and they would end up without work, they won't work. And, as a result, because they won't have any incentive to work. So it's creating disincentives, counterproductive. Right, or just people will just move out of the country because of these such high tax rates of 100%, and your tax revenue would again be zero, right? And if you assume that the government, let's say, decides to increase the tax rate to somewhere around 15-20%, so initially this may lead to an increase in tax revenue since people are still motivated to work, although tax rates have gone up, so they are still motivated to work and generate income. However, with the tax rates continuing to rise, not only individuals, businesses as well, by the way. Individuals and businesses may start to reduce their economic activities. They'll try to seek some sort of tax shelters, or they will engage in tax evasion, because we're talking about tax rates in general. It includes the corporate taxes as well. So consequently, tax revenues will begin to decline for the government despite higher tax rates, right? And after a point, any further increase in tax rate will result in diminishing tax revenue for the government, as individuals and businesses will basically adjust their behavior patterns and their behavior to, they'll adjust their behavior to minimize their own tax burdens, right? They'll adjust their behavior, and we'll see right now that what sort of adjustments will they do. They will adjust their behavior to minimize their tax burden, right? So, guys, Arthur Laffer said that if tax rates in the economy rise beyond the efficient tax rate T star, in a diagram, tax revenues would start falling, right? Tax revenues would start falling as individuals and businesses basically what they do is that they adjust their behavior to minimize the tax burdens that they're facing because tax rates are so high beyond the efficient tax rate. And he argued, Arthur Laffer argued that tax revenues basically will go down. As he said, the tax revenues will go down beyond T star, right? They're going down beyond, T star, they're dropping. And he identified three primary reasons, right? He identified three primary reasons for the decline in tax revenues, and he said that basically high tax rates are becoming counterproductive and self-defeating in terms of revenue generation for three main reasons, right? Counterproductive and self-defeating. This is something that you should write in the exam in terms of revenue generation. So what's happening is that he argued that after T star, basically, workers will lose the incentive to work harder and longer hours. It will also create disincentives for entrepreneurship and business expansion, right? Workers would prefer leisure more instead of working extra hours and more, as they know as they know that much of that extra income that they will generate by working extra hours would be taxed away. What's the point? There's no incentive. So it's a disincentive, counterproductive. On the other hand, businesses would also want to take less risks of business expansion, and take less risk of expanding and then ending up earning higher profits. So all those activities that are done by businesses to earn higher profits, right? All those activities will be reduced as they know that so much of the higher profits that they will end up making, if they end up making, need to be given away as taxes. So we are basically disincentivizing work and entrepreneurship and business expansion, ultimately resulting in lower tax revenues for the government if our tax rates are beyond T star. And so all the taxes in this range. So if the taxes are in this range, if your taxes are in this range, basically you see a drop in your tax revenues, right, in your tax take. So also he argued that if tax rates are very, very high, skilled workers, and not only skilled workers, in fact businesses and entrepreneurs, right, entrepreneurs and businesses would prefer moving out and emigrating as they feel less incentivized here in the country, resulting in emigration and brain drain, right? And emigration would result in brain drain, right? So and the emigration, and the brain drain of labor, and also you it's not only the workers moving out, it's the entrepreneurs moving out as well, probably closing out domestic business activity and moving elsewhere. So this brain drain is done in order to seek lower tax rates in other countries because that's an incentive for them. And you see, the thing is, because you need to tell the reasons why this is happening. You need to don't just say that. You can't just say in the exam that higher tax rates beyond T star, efficient tax rate would end up reducing the tax revenue. You have to explain why. So these three reasons you will give, and you will say that if brain drain occurs, if these workers in these large businesses with huge profits and entrepreneurs who are making huge profits, and these entrepreneurs with high skills, and in fact the high skilled labor like doctors and lawyers and accountants and engineers, who had the highest incomes in our country, and they were also paying high taxes. If they move out, who were the biggest source of tax providers, these businesses and high skilled labor who were the biggest source of tax providers to the government for their tax revenue collection, if they move out, we would see a huge drop in tax revenues collected by the government of the country, right? So that's why the tax revenues, that's why Laffer said that beyond T star, tax revenues would start falling. Citing emigration is another reason why this would happen, right? He also said that Laffer also argued that very high tax rates, tax rates. I mean, in this region, very high tax rates in this region would prioritize, activities such as tax evasion, and it would promote activities such as tax evasion and tax avoidance. Hence reducing the overall tax take, that is the total tax revenue collected by the government, or total tax revenues for the government. And tax evasion is basically an illegal activity, because it's illegal because when you're evading taxes, you're not declaring your complete income, right? While tax avoidance, on the other hand, though is legal, it means that you avoid taxes by finding some sort of loophole in your tax system to avoid paying, or some sort of manipulation within the law, or finding some loophole in the tax laws and the tax systems to avoid, and you end up avoid paying taxes. But the thing is that both tax evasion and tax evasion and tax avoidance, both of these reduces tax revenues for the government, right? But with high tax rates beyond T star, we are promoting such activities if tax rates are too high, and that is the reason. I mean, these three become the reason why high tax, if these tax rates become too high and they are in this region beyond T star. Like I said, these three are the reasons why people and businesses adjust their behaviors to minimize their tax burden, and the adjustment of the behavior yahi hai na. This is the adjustment that they end up working less hours. Businesses don't want to work hard. Businesses don't want to expand. They end up moving abroad. People end up avoiding taxes. So this is the sort of adjustments that's happening, right? And the end up result is that it becomes counterproductive. Tax rates were increased. You ended up increasing tax rates because you wanted more tax revenue. That's the reason why you ended up increasing tax rates, general tax rates across in the economy. It could be income tax rates, let's say. It could be corporate tax rates, right? So that with high tax rates, you would end up collecting high tax revenues. That's what you thought, and you would spend that tax revenue on various government spending projects and welfare benefits to reduce income inequality. But you ended up, your tax rates were so high, as Laffer says, that you ended up reducing tax revenues for the government, right? Now that we have understood the Laffer curve, I want you to draw attention to how and where can we use the Laffer curve argument in our P4 essays. If let's say that we are attempting a question on policies to redistribute incomes and wealth, and one of the policies the government may resort to is that the government, we could say that the government could implement, or we have already studied this as well, that one of the policies to redistribute incomes and wealth is that the government could implement or adjust progressive income taxes. That is, increasing taxes on workers with salaries in the highest income tax bands, and then using the extra tax revenue collected to finance the transfer payments and welfare benefits, and finance the extra government spending on healthcare and education. This will reduce disposable incomes for the rich and increase incomes for the poor. Also, we could say that it will increase incomes at the lower end for the poor, who already have a high marginal propensity to consume, high MPC, which will increase their consumption and increase their standard of living and reduce income inequality. Reducing the disparity between the rich and the poor. So yes, objective achieved, great. However, you could critique and evaluate this argument. That is the argument that is in increasing the income tax rate, the progressive income taxes on the rich with the highest income tax bands. You could critique this argument, and that will result in higher tax revenues, which could be used to finance, welfare spending and essential spending to reduce income inequality. However, you could critique and evaluate this by bringing up the Laffer curve argument, by saying that according to the Laffer curve, increasing taxation levels specifically for those who earn higher incomes distorts incentives in the labor market, especially for those who are earning higher incomes. And for the highest paid skilled labor, it will distort incentives in the labor market, just like we studied right now as well, disincentivizing labor to work longer hours, right, and preventing entrepreneurial activity and business expansion, ultimately causing tax revenues to fall. And we saw these three reasons: create disincentives to work harder, create disincentives for businesses, and reduce entrepreneurial spirit and business expansion. and it will result your highest paid labor and skilled labor to move abroad. So will your entrepreneurs go abroad, right? So ultimately, it will result in tax revenues to fall. And what will happen when the tax revenues will fall? This will deteriorate government finances, and the government might need to resort to borrowing to finance government spending, increasing national debt in the economy, which is obviously bad for poor countries. The governments may then struggle to redistribute incomes and wealth, right? Because they don't have the money available to redistribute incomes and wealth. They don't have the money available to spend to redistribute incomes and wealth on welfare benefits, hence increasing relative poverty and unequal income distributions, and just leaving the government empty-handed to suffer on one of its major macroeconomic objectives of equal distribution of income. So this is a very good argument that you can bring in regarding the Laffer curve. So fall in incentives to work, and the thing is that fall in incentives to work and reduction in entrepreneurship, accompanied with the risk of brain drain, as already we discussed, as suggested by the Laffer curve. If tax rates on people with the highest income tax bands go up, right? If those tax rates exceed the optimal and efficient tax rates, then this will reduce productive potential for the economy as well, shifting the PPC and LRAS to the left, reducing potential growth in the economy, right? Because obviously, your highest skilled labor is moving abroad, plus entrepreneurship is decreasing, so innovation will decrease as well. So these are factors that shift your PPC and LRAS to the left, reducing productive capacity in the economy, right? So, definitely, yes, you could argue that policies to redistribute income by increasing income tax rates on upper income tax bands, on the highest income tax bands, on people who are on those workers with salaries, increasing tax rates on workers with salaries in the highest income tax bands, and then using the extra tax revenue to finance welfare benefits and transfer payments is a good thing. It's a good policy to redistribute incomes and wealth, and it will happen. Because ultimately, you will spend that money, you will give $1 extra to the poor in this way through welfare benefits, and they will spend that because of a higher MPC, and definitely, it will end up reducing in income inequality. But according to the Laffer curve, if these tax rates exceed the efficient and optimal tax rates in the economy, then this will have counterproductive effects. So, and this policy would be self-defeating, right? So hence, it follows that a rise in tax rates by the government to finance for higher government spending on essential public services or necessary expenditures like education and healthcare, or maybe to finance welfare benefits to redistribute income, doesn't always guarantee those increasing tax rates to earn higher tax revenue so that the government could spend or finance its spending, whether that spending is on welfare benefits to redistribute incomes, or it is essential necessary spending in the economy, or maybe the government just wants to increase government spending, to maybe stimulate the economy. So that really doesn't guarantees, higher tax revenues. So it doesn't always guarantee high tax revenues as suggested by the Laffer curve, leaving the government to find it difficult to finance its spending. Now another usage that you can write for the Laffer curve, if there is not a separate question for Laffer curve, but still it could be used in other ways as well in other topic essays. That is that when you were evaluating expansionary fiscal policy, we studied the Laffer curve argument and under the evaluation for expansionary fiscal policy. I remember that, and I told you that I'll be making a separate video on it. So basically, while evaluating expansionary fiscal policy, and you say that expansionary fiscal policy, as we know, that involves reducing tax, it basically involves tax cuts, reducing tax rates, and increasing government spending to stimulate aggregate demand and boost the economy, and increasing spending and investment in the economy to so the thing is that if you reduce, and one argument that we give is that expansionary fiscal policy, as it involves increasing government spending and reducing tax rates, it results in a budget deficit, and the government then needs to borrow, which increases national debt, right? So expansionary fiscal policy means enacting a budget deficit. Ultimately, you will end up, as your tax rates would go down, you will end up with reducing your tax revenues and increasing spending. So definitely, you would end up with a budget deficit, and then you will need to borrow to finance that. And in expansive fiscal policy, we said that when your tax rates are going down, your tax revenues will go down as well. But you can bring the Laffer curve argument that you can say what you can say is that, if you're saying that your tax rates are going down, so you could say that, what, if your tax rates in the economy are beyond the efficient tax rate on the Laffer curve, right? If your tax rates are already too high, so let's say your tax rates are maybe somewhere over here, right? So if your tax rates are somewhere over here, let's say T1, and so which means that your tax revenue is somewhere over here, let's say TR1. So for example, if you reduce the tax rates and your tax rates are actually going down, so according to the Laffer curve, you will end up increasing your tax revenue instead of reducing it, because when you are actually reducing your tax rates here from, let's say, T1 to T2, you're getting close to the optimum or the efficient tax rate, right? So you're getting close, getting close and back towards the efficient tax rate, right? So here there's a movement now towards increasing your tax revenues now. So you could actually bring this argument and say that, what, I mean, fine, expansionary fiscal policy would mean that your tax rates would go down and so would your tax revenues, and you would end up in a budget deficit since you want to spend more and then you'll need to borrow and all that national debt argument that you can bring up. But then the Laffer curve says that if the tax rates in the economy are beyond the efficient tax rates, expansionary fiscal policy in the form of, direct tax cuts could actually raise the revenue for the government, and why will the revenue go up? I mean, with three reasons that we have studied. The tax revenue would go up because it would end up promoting entrepreneurial spirit. It would promote business expansion. Ultimately, tax revenues would go up, right? Because obviously businesses would earn more profits, they would expand, and tax revenues would go up, maybe in the form of corporate tax revenues. Workers would be incentivized to work more and be more productive, so income tax revenues would go up. Also, when your tax revenues are lower, when your tax revenues were increasing, we said there would be emigration with an E, outward migration. But if your tax rates are going down now, there would be inward migration into the country. So वही three reasons हैं, but we just reverse them, right? So it will promote entrepreneurial spirit. Tax cuts would promote entrepreneurial spirit right now, as per the Laffer curve only. Because ये जरूर लिखना कि it's because of this is something that is linked with the Laffer curve. That's what the Laffer curve says. That's what Arthur Laffer said regarding these three reasons, right? So it's the three reasons that we're talking about. Promoting entrepreneurial spirit. Number two, inward migration. Because of a reduction in tax rates, people will be like, okay, fine, in this country tax rates are going down, so let's maybe move to this country, because people will be incentivized to come and work here. So, or maybe people who went abroad might come back to work here. So inward migration hogi, and there would be, and the incentive to be more productive and work longer hours. In this context, I'm saying to be more productive and work longer hours would again increase. All of these three combined would increase the net. All of which would result into a net increase in tax revenues for the government, thus improving the government finances, not worsening government finances. So all of this would improve government finances. It will not, deteriorate government finances, right? So this is something that you could mention as of a use of your Laffer curve. You could bring the Laffer curve argument over here, right? Because expansionary fiscal policy, I remember we studied that, in expansionary fiscal policy, when we were studying about the cons for expansionary fiscal policy, we studied that, obviously the government is enacting a budget deficit, so it would result in a expansionary fiscal policy is associated with deterioration of government finances. Remember we studied that. So then for government finances so you could say that the government finances will not be deteriorated, as what the Laffer curve is saying right now. If your tax rates are reduced, and they were already very high below the efficient level, right? So guys, now the question arises that what do we learn from the Laffer curve? Or you could say, why does the Laffer curve really matters? So guys, definitely the Laffer curve really matters, because Laffer curve is of particular interest to policymakers, as it highlights the potential trade-off between tax rates and tax revenues, right? While increasing your tax rates might seem like a straightforward way to generate more government revenue, but the Laffer curve suggests that there is an upper limit into the effectiveness of this approach. And it tells the policymakers, come on, hang on. increasing your tax rates may seem like a very good way to increase government revenue, but there's an upper limit to the effectiveness of this method. It says beyond a certain point, higher tax rates can have detrimental effects on economic growth, on productivity, and your overall tax revenue. So understanding the Laffer curve helps the policymakers consider the potential consequences of tax policy decisions. It will help them, it will help them implement effective tax rates in the economy, efficient tax rates in the economy, tax rates that are not counterproductive, tax rates that do not reduce the incentive, tax rates that do not result in emigration and brain drain. So understanding the Laffer curve helps policymakers consider the potential consequences of their tax policy decisions. So it encourages the policymakers to basically have a balanced approach, right, to taxation that takes into account the incentives and the behaviors of individuals and businesses, ultimately aiming to strike a balance between taxation and economic prosperity. If you don't strike this balance, things will be worse off. You increase your taxes by increasing your tax rates and you go on doing it, you will harm your growth, development, and prosperity in this way. So it is encouraging to have a balanced approach to taxation that takes into account the incentives and the behaviors of individuals and the businesses, ultimately, aiming to have and strike a balance between taxation and economic prosperity. So that's it, guys. I'll be ending the video here now. I hope you understood this topic. I'll see you all around in the next video with another topic. Until then, take care.